Okay, before we get started, here are the key terms. If you'd like to hit pause that you can write them down, you can pay attention to them throughout the video, and they'll also be presented at the end of the video as well. While the North was experiencing an era of industrial growth, urbanization, and immigration, another era was emerging in the South. This era became known as the Jim Crow era. After the Civil War, the American South needed to be reconstructed. Their economic system, rooted in slavery, was now completely destroyed. Their landscape, way of life, and morale was destroyed as well. With the emancipation of over 2 million African Americans, one of the biggest challenges was race relations in the South. Though some had hoped that the end of slavery would mean the beginning of new opportunities for African Americans, it was actually the beginning of another 100 years of racism, discrimination, segregation, and second-class citizenship. Reconstruction failed in the South. Northerners began to lose interest and felt that the racist ideologies of the South would never be erased. Once the last of the Union troops left and Southern Reconstruction governments took over home rule, the South was more resurrected than reconstructed. Southerners, though they no longer could have slaves, worked hard to make sure that the social order of the South was restored, where African Americans were in the lowest social order and remained there with no chance to rise up. Sharecropping and labor contracts became common, as many emancipated slaves found themselves bound to work on the same plantations they had toiled all of their lives for meager pay and with little chance to do anything else. The failure to provide proper education for emancipated slaves is partially to blame for this. These poor individuals were illiterate with few skills other than farming and domestic work. Therefore, they were often left with no choice but to continue working for their former masters. Southern states also employed methods to prevent African Americans from voting. The 15th Amendment, which guaranteed equal voting rights for men, was supposed to ensure that free blacks could now exercise their right to vote. Many Southern states, however, worked hard to disenfranchise these new citizens. The franchise is the right to vote, so to disenfranchise someone is to prevent them from voting. This chart shows the different methods used by various states to accomplish this. The most common restriction was the poll tax. In order to vote, you had to pay a tax up front, and oftentimes, recently emancipated African Americans did not have enough money to pay the poll tax, so therefore they weren't able to vote in that state. You could also be forced to take a literacy test if you couldn't prove a certain level of education. So because you took one of these tests, you know that they can be very tricky, and even if you were literate or semi-literate, it was easy to fail. Another restriction was a property test. In this case, you would have to prove that you own property in order to vote. What some states noticed was happening was that poor whites were also being restricted from voting. Because they're poor, they couldn't afford to pay a poll tax. Oftentimes they were illiterate and didn't own property. So that's where the grandfather clause comes into play. So the grandfather clause means that even if you don't meet these other requirements, as long as your grandfather had registered to vote and had voted in a previous election, you too can exercise the right to vote. So if you're a recently emancipated slave, it's obvious that your grandfather didn't vote, so that's why only poor whites could benefit from this clause that was instituted in some of these states. Southern states also began to pass laws that forced the segregation of black and white citizens, especially with regards to transportation. In Louisiana, the Separate Car Act was passed in 1890 that required all black passengers to sit in separate cars located in the rear of the train. Homer Plessy was a shoemaker who was 1/16 black and was considered black under Louisiana law. He challenged this by sitting in the white-only car on the train. He believed the law violated his 14th Amendment rights, which required equal protection under the law, so he allowed himself to be arrested so he could take the case to court in the hopes that the law would be struck down as unconstitutional. The Louisiana Supreme Court ruled against Homer Plessy, so he took his case to the Supreme Court of the United States. In Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court also decided against Plessy. In an 8-1 decision, the Supreme Court stated that the 14th Amendment did not apply to social equality, only political equality, and that a state could segregate based on race as long as there were equal facilities. This ruling became known as the separate but equal doctrine. The court did not define equal, and it was interpreted as equal in quantity, not quality. After the ruling, separate schools, drinking fountains, parks, hotels, hospitals, and even cemeteries were segregated. White-only and colored-only signs dotted the Southern landscape. The Jim Crow era had officially begun. The term Jim Crow came from a popular minstrel show where a white performer, whose name was T.D. Rice, dressed up in blackface and played a character called Jim Crow. He would make fun of African Americans, portraying them as ignorant and childlike. The name Jim Crow quickly became synonymous with racial tensions in the South. In addition to segregation and discrimination in all facets of Southern society, African Americans also faced increased violence after the Civil War. Lynching, which means to murder someone without due process of law, usually by a mob, became common in the South. Most of these victims were hanged, allegedly for crimes of murder and rape. It quickly became known, however, that many victims were killed for not moving out of the way of a white person on the sidewalk, accidentally brushing up against a white woman, or saying something that a white person found offensive. Oftentimes, African Americans were beaten, mutilated, and burned alive before their bodies were hanged for public display. In extreme cases, body parts were taken from the victim and sold as souvenirs. From 1889 to 1918, more than 2,400 African Americans were hanged or burned at the stake. Ida B. Wells Barnett, an African American journalist and the first woman to hyphenate her last name, campaigned against lynching and fought to have an anti-lynching law passed. Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois also became leaders in the fight for African American civil rights, though they had different beliefs and approaches as to how to achieve them. Once you've defined the terms in your notes, be sure to complete your Venn diagram on Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Keep track of the website or websites that you use to find the information. The specific instructions can be found on the handout. Don't forget to also answer the Think questions and upload your summary to Schoology, and please write down any questions that you have that you want to review in class. Have a good night.